What was the great economist Ludwig von Mises' life like before he came to the United States? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principal case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined as I am every week by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you too, and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Subscribe to our YouTube channel if you're new to the show, you're just watching it for the first time. Come and visit us at fff.org. Subscribe to our FFF Daily, which brings you original articles and links to very principled perspectives on libertarianism in the mainstream press and on the internet. Also, let me take this opportunity to announce that we've got a conference coming up. It's an online series. It's not going to be a conference like a one-day conference or a two-day conference. It's going to be a weekly series entitled JFK's Foreign Policy and the Assassination. And we've put together a fascinating lineup of speakers. I tell you, you're going to be enthralled. The purpose of the conference is to provide an introduction, a synopsis, for people that are not really well versed in the Kennedy assassination as to what happened and why it happened. Begins on March 2nd. More details. If you subscribe to FFF Daily, you'll get all the details. I've already started talking about it in my blog at fff.org. Admission will be free, and registrations will open up in February. So, Richard, you know, the economist that you and I have been influenced by so deeply is Ludwig von Mises. I mean, when I first discovered libertarianism, okay, I liked Hayek and I liked Friedman, but for me, they didn't compare to Mises. Mises, to me, was the principled, uncompromising advocate of a free market. And I was enthralled by all of his books, all of his articles, his works, and I know that you feel the same way. In fact, I don't think there's anybody around that knows more about Mises and his background, his life, his works than you. And so I thought, well, let's talk about Mises, but let's do something a little bit different for people that don't have the real grasp of Mises's life. Let's talk about what Mises was doing before he came to the United States. I mean, we're all sort of familiar with Mises as a professor of he was a professor at New York University. I don't know if he would be a professor of economics. He ran a seminar there, and that in itself is a fascinating story that maybe we can end up with in this segment of the Libertarian Angle. But I think going back into the United States Mises, when he was living in Austria and what his life was about and how he got influenced, I thought would be a nice little perspective to share with our viewers. So let me turn it over to you and tell us a little bit about Mises, the man that works prior to the United States.
Well, that's interesting. Well, he was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in September 1881 in the eastern region of Galicia. He came from a relatively Orthodox Jewish family. His father and his grandfather, great-grandparents, his whole family, I suppose, were prominent members of the Orthodox Jewish community there in the capital city of Lemberg. In fact, a few months before Ludwig Mises was born, the Emperor of Austria, Franz Joseph, had ennobled his great-grandfather for his service to the empire as a leader of the Jewish community in that part of the empire. And that is how Ludwig Mises came to be Ludwig von Mises. The von, V-O-N, is a low title of nobility, which could pass on to the heirs of the person who has been ennobled. His father was a railway engineer. The family moved to Vienna, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in the 1890s when Ludwig was a relatively young boy. He went to a high school that was geared towards young people who were planning to go on to the university. He studied at the University of Vienna and graduated in 1906 with a doctoral degree in jurisprudence. If someone was interested in economics, you studied your specialization in economics through the law faculty. So besides being an economist, he actually was a qualified PhD lawyer. But it's kind of interesting is that when he first went to the university, his interest in law, but he actually was also interested in history. He was greatly influenced by a variation of the socialist trends and sympathies of the time. But while there, as he tells the story, in, I believe it was Christmas 1901, during the Christmas holiday, he came across a book by the founder of the Austrian school, Karl Menger, a book that in English is just called Principles of Economics, which he had never read before. He knew nothing about it really. And he said that he read that book over the Christmas break, his university Christmas break. And as he put it in his memoirs, that made him an economist. That totally transformed him. With the upshot that he then proceeded to participate in and study with a very prominent member of the Austrian School of Economics, who was a teacher at the university, Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, who also had been a minister of finance for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And what he did was that he developed a series of ideas in his university days that was one of his claims to fame. He ended up writing a book called, in English, The Theory of Money and Credit. It was considered a transformative, revolutionary book at the time in his attempt to explain a number of things. What is the basis of people's demands for money? How does money originate? How does money have its value? How do changes in the supply of money influence output, employment, the structure of prices in the economy? And it culminated in his formulation of what has become known as the Austrian theory of the business cycle. That being that it is not something inherent in the market economy, but the government's mismanagement and abuse of central banking, its manipulation of the supply of money, its indirect influences on distorting and manipulating interest rate that sets going the wave of the boom followed by the bust, the inflationary, unstable investment climate followed by the downturn of a recession, which is the corrective period when resources reshuffle and get rebalanced to bring the economy back to normal. And that became a major influence in particularly the first half of 20th century monetary and business cycle thinking. It inspired Friedrich Hayek, who was a young associate of his, about 20 years younger than Mises, to develop his own variation on this, which he internationally made famous when he, Hayek, moved to the London School of Economics in the early 1930s and became one of the most preeminent and high-profile opponents of the emerging Keynesian revolution developed by the British economist John Maynard Keynes. But that was his first major impact. He got out of law school. He published this book in 1912. And the question was, how would he make a living? The problem is that academic positions are few and far between. So what he ended up doing, and he did this for the next 25 years of his life, other than during the war years of the First World War, which I'll briefly mention, he became a policy wonk. That is, he went to work and soon was promoted to a rather senior economic analyst for the Vienna Chamber of Commerce of Crafts, Industry, Crafts, and Commerce. He was responsible for analyzing monetary and fiscal policy, government regulations, international trade patterns. And he therefore became a highly prominent and well-known voice in questions of economic legislation coming before the Austrian Parliament from around 1909 until he left Austria in 1934. But in the midst of this, while he's doing all this detailed policy work and all the factual information on a day-to-day basis in his office, at night, he's writing. And it's these writings at night, the policy wonk by day and the wider economic theorist and social philosopher at night that makes his reputation. Because his career got interrupted by the First World War. He served in the Austrian army. He fought on the Eastern Front against the Russians. Of course, that was the Imperial Russian Army. Was 3 times decorated for bravery under fire. One time capturing an entire artillery site of a Russian unit. But when the war ended, he went back to his work at the Chamber of Commerce. And it was a revolutionary time, Jacob. As perhaps some of the viewers and listeners may not appreciate, there had been the communist or the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in the midst of the First World War in 1917. And this inspired other radical socialist groups in other parts of Europe right after the war ended in 1918, believed that they could bring a socialist revolution to all of Europe. So there was soon a socialist, indeed a Marxist revolution in the neighboring German state of Bavaria. And there was a short-lived Soviet regime there. Then the communists seized power in neighboring Hungary. And for about a half a year, there was a radical Bolshevik government there that was eventually overthrown by invading Romanians. But in Austria itself, there was this strong radical socialist movement. It's time to transform Austria, the new, smaller, post-World War I Austria, into a socialist state as well. Now, Mises then took a challenge, and that was the socialists were going to say private property will be ended, there'll be no more market relationships, private property will be nationalized, the government will control everything in the name of the people and will centrally plan. And Mises' response to that is what established his claim to fame around the world for the rest of his life, because he wrote an essay that was published in German in 1920 called Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. And he asked a mundane but profoundly important question. Okay, Mr. Socialist, you've nationalized the means of production, you've ended markets, prices, competition, you have a central planning agency. How are you going to rationally and efficiently use the resources that you now have at your disposal, the national resources, and produce the goods that people actually want in an effective and efficient and least costly way to get the most out of them possible to serve the needs of the masses, the people, better than the outcomes of the market economy that you wish to abolish? And the answer that Mises came up with, if you end the institutions of market, prices, competition, and private property, you do away with the institutional prerequisites for rational calculation. Without prices, we don't know what consumers want. Without prices for the inputs, we don't know the opportunity cost values of labor, resources, capital, in the multitude of alternative uses, and the least costly way to combine them to get the most that we have and not be wastefully using resources for purpose A as opposed to purpose B. Now, the socialists were in an uproar about this, Jacob. Oh, this is a reactionary statement. This is an apologism for the evil capitalists. Oh, the Austrian version of that time of the 1%. Okay, okay. But now they realize that he's asked a question that needs an answer. Okay, if you're going to plan an economy, how are you going to do it? To do it rationally, efficiently, productively. And then they said, oh, well, you know, we can play with prices too. And Mises and then Hayek later showed that this was impossible to replicate. It's either markets or planning. There's no in between. Now, this caused the firestorm of controversy for the rest of the 20th century during his life. Now, perversely, for most of that time, rationalizers, apologists for socialism, even if they weren't socialists, well, we're going to objectively compare markets versus planned economies. Oh, you know, Mises and Hayek, they're too extreme. Oh, there's always a way to plan. But of course, by the 1980s and 1990s, when the Soviet Union was imploding, when the stagnation and the inefficiency, nor the tyranny, just the economic aspect, was becoming clear in all of the socialist countries, the communist countries where central planning had been imposed, that this was an unworkable system that not only took away freedom, but took away any ability to have a reasonable standard of living compared to what was going on in the Western, more market regimes, that even the apologists for socialism ended up saying, Mises was right. Mises was right. Oh, I didn't mean to say it. I don't think it was a grudging admission that Mises had been right already in 1920. And I'll just add that that article was then expanded by him into a full book that came out in 1922, which in English is called Socialism, an Economic and Sociological Analysis. And what he does here, he doesn't just deal with the economics of socialism. How will socialism work politically? What are the social impacts of socialism? What happens in international relations between socialist regimes? And whether it be political, economic, social, or ethical, he basically demolishes all of the rationales and arguments as to why a socialist regime would either be able to work or be better than a functioning market economy. So basically in 1920, 1922, Mises was showing, 100 years ago right now, was showing why the entire experience of experiments in socialist central planning in the 20th century were going to end up to be a disastrous failure. So he saw that already 100 years ago, before all of these terrible things had to be imposed on tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people to their despair and sorrow. At the same time, if I can just go back here, Jacob. So besides doing these writings, he's a policy analyst working with the Vienna Chamber of Commerce. And besides fighting the socialists who want to nationalize things in Austria, the new Austrian socialist-oriented government is instituting a welfare state. Income redistributions, free housing, free food, free this, free that. And what is the new government resorting to? Well, how far can you take taxation? Finally, there's nothing left to tax. So they resorted to printing money, right, to cover the budget deficits of spending far more than they had as tax revenue. They resorted to the printing press. And so Austria was facing the same type of destructive hyperinflation that was occurring in neighboring Germany in the early 1920s. And Mises worked hard and finally effectively to influence a man who was then the prime minister, the chancellor of Austria in 1922 and 1923, to bring the inflation to a halt before it reached the end point of a destruction of the money and the society, the way it did in late 1923 in neighboring Germany. So he helped bring an inflation to an end before its disaster. And then out of that, he helped write the bylaws of putting a reconstructed Austrian central bank on a gold standard. If we can't have monetary freedom, at least leash the monetary authority from wanton increase of the money supply. Make them have an anchor in gold, which limits their ability to turn the handle of the monetary printing press. He also was working on reducing government spending in other ways, trying to streamline the bloated bureaucracy to get rid of people out of government agencies. Now, of course, a lot of this were failures. And in fact, look back after leaving Austria and coming to the United States with great despair. He says there, I began as an economic reformer. I ended up as the historian of decline. In other words, merely explaining why so many things went bad in Austria and Europe in general. But that was the environment in which Mises was writing. He then wrote a book in the 1920s on liberalism, a restatement of the case for classical liberalism in terms of individual liberty, private enterprise, free markets, rule of law, absolutely limited government, leaving basically a laissez-faire economic and social environment. And we then followed that with a collection of essays on critique of interventionism. Well, it's not only the socialism that's unworkable, but any form of government infringement of price controls, business regulations, redistribution of wealth. And the upshot of it is he came to the conclusion that from an actual factual point of view, socialism is unworkable. Intervention is like throwing sand into the machine and preventing the society from effectively operating. There is no alternative to a functioning, radically free market economy and society. So that by the end of the 1920s, because of these works and his work as a policy analyst, he was one of those well-known economists in general, but advocates of economic liberty in Europe. So if any of the viewers and listeners are familiar with Milton Friedman, they know that Milton Friedman was one of the most prominent advocates of free enterprise and relatively limited government in the post-World War II period in America. And that he influenced a lot of people's thinkings. Well, if you want to make an analogy, think of Ludwig von Mises as the Milton Friedman of Europe before the Second World War, in terms of his name recognition. And people assuming that if you have to respond to an argument, you have to respond to Mises's argument because his is one of the most damning and effective. And so before he came to America, he was this leading light for the preservation of the principles of economic freedom and personal liberty and limited government in the Europe of his time. And I'll just finish with this. I know I'm talking too much, but you asked. So in 1934, there was like a mini civil war going on in Austria in the wake of the rise of Nazism in Germany next door in 1933. The upshot of this civil war is that the more radical social democrats were defeated. A quasi-fascist government came to power in Austria and ruled in Austria until Germany annexed Austria in 1938. And so given this situation, Mises jumped at a chance that he'd never had before. And that is, he was offered a full-time teaching position, a full-time teaching position at the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. So while still formally connected with the Chamber of Commerce, he went on an extended leave of absence and moved to Geneva, Switzerland, and was teaching there in a full-time position from 1934 until he then moved to the United States in the midst of the Second World War in the summer of 1940. It was during that period, as he later said, in the tranquility of the Graduate Institute, where he could devote himself to ideas and not be constantly sidetracked by the everyday policy issues that his work at the Chamber had constantly been pulling them back into, he wrote the book that is perhaps his most famous. And that book was the German version of what we now know as Human Action, a treatise on economics. It appeared in its English version in 1949, but just before he left Switzerland to come to the United States as a wartime refugee of a type, it was published in its German version in Switzerland as Nationalökonomie. So those 6 years in Switzerland enabled him to write the magnum opus, the great work that is perhaps his greatest claim to fame.
That's a great synopsis. So he discovers Carl Menger's Principles of Economics. And did you say he's a university student at that point?
Correct.
All right. And then so he starts studying under Eugen von Bomberberg, who had himself studied under Menger?
No. What had happened, Carl Menger had written his book and published it in 1871. Bomberg and the man who became his brother-in-law, another now famous Austrian economist, Friedrich von Mises, were graduate students together. They didn't study with Menger. They had attended the University of Vienna, but not with Menger. Then they had gone off to do their own graduate work or postgraduate studies at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. And while doing their postgraduate studies, they discovered Menger's book together and read it and became inspired by him, and therefore became his intellectual students, not the actual students. So they then wrote their own theses on applications of Menger's ideas. The result is that from this, Friedrich von Mises, he developed the concept of what today we call opportunity cost. What is the cost of anything? It is the subjective evaluation of the alternative foregone. And Bomberg, he's most famous for taking Menger's ideas and developing what we now call the Austrian theory of capital and interest. Now they came back to Austria and became professors their own way. Wieser taught, remember, it's the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Wieser ends up teaching at the German University in Prague, today's Czech Republic, but it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Böhm-Bawerk goes and teaches at the University of Innsbruck in Austria, and is interspaced with 3 terms of becoming Minister of Finance. And if I can just say a thing about him, his longest term was from 1900 to 1904. And in those 4 years that he was Minister of Finance, he balanced the budget, cut taxes, reduced spending, and ended up even producing a surplus to pay off some debt. He finally resigned because of irregularities in the Austrian military budget, corruption. And then he went to teach until the remainder of his life. In 1914, the last 10 years of his life, he was then teaching at the University of Vienna. And when Menger had retired from teaching in 1903, Wieser was brought to Vienna to replace Menger. So from around 1903 on, or 1904, we had both Wieser and Böhm-Bawerk at the University of Vienna, now that Menger had retired. And it was Wieser and Böhm-Bawerk that Mises actually was more directly studying with.
Okay. So then in 1934, Mises goes to Switzerland. And
right.
He was Jewish. Obviously, Hitler had come into power
yes.
In 33, I guess.
Yes.
To what extent was the anti-Jewish fervor motivating him to go to Switzerland? Did that play any role at all?
Yes. Hayek later said that Mises had a deep frustration because he did have this international reputation and recognition that in his own home country, he could never get a full-time professorship at a university. And he attributed this to 2 things, being Jewish and his intransigent principled defense of classical liberalism and especially economic freedom. The fact is there were many Jewish professors. There was strong anti-Semitism in Austria, but there were Jewish professors at the University of Vienna, the University of Innsbruck, or Graz. So basically what it came down to is that he was denied an actual professorship in his home country, basically because people hated his politics. Or as Hayek said, critics of him viewed him as something grotesque. How could you be both Jewish and an advocate of laissez-faire? Because the presumption was if you were Jewish, you were most likely to be socialist leaning. So here's this guy who's both Jewish and an advocate of evil capitalism. It's like all the strikes are against the guy in the academic environment taking him in. So he taught he worked at the Chamber of Commerce, and he taught as an unsalaried lecturer, right? Oh boy, what a treat. An unsalaried lecturer teaching 1 course a year at the university as what they called a Privatdozent, a private lecturer.
All right, so then if we jump forward to the onset of World War II,
yes.
We have Mises coming to the United States.
Yes,
and that
in the summer of 1940.
1940, and that journey is detailed in Margit Mises's book, My Years with Ludwig von Mises. That was his wife. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey to the United States in our waning moments here?
Yeah. We know retrospectively that in spite of everything happening in World War II, Switzerland remained a neutral country. But in the spring of 1940, in April of 1940, after having conquered Poland in September, in April of 1940, Hitler orders the invasion of Denmark and Norway. And then on May 10th of 1940, Hitler orders the invasion of the lowlands, Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and France. So now in May and June, the Low Countries and then France are overrun by the Germans. France has to sue for a peace, an armistice on June 22nd, 1940, and the Germans occupy well over half of Germany, and then have this little, puppet regime of Free France and Vichy France. But the question is, where is Hitler going to attack next? Remember, Hitler kept talking about unifying all the German people in one Reich, in Europe. Well, Switzerland has a huge German-speaking population as well as French and Italian. So is Switzerland going to be next on Hitler's hit list? So who could know that? So as a consequence, Mises made a decision that it'd probably be wise, as many other people did, to leave Switzerland. And through the intercession of friends in the United States, it was arranged for him to have a visitor visa to come to the United States with the prospectus of a teaching position. So, so the consequence was that in July 1940, he made a tortuous journey with his wife, Margaret, through southern France, avoiding German patrols and Vichy questioning too much. Ended up going through Spain to Portugal and getting a ship from Lisbon to the United States. And he arrived in the United States in early August.
Yeah, that's a fascinating journey that his coming to the United States. And then he ends up as a professor of economics. Well, he has an unsalaried position at New York University that's funded by private people, because to be a principled capitalist at that point here in the United States in 1940 was about the worst thing you could be, because the onslaught of socialism here and the welfare state had gripped America. So here you have this fantastic economist that has a difficult time here in the United States.
Yeah, in fact, for the first 5 years that he was in the States, 1940 to 1945, he had no teaching position. Through the generosity of, it sounds strange now given their political biases today, through the generosity of the Rockefeller Foundation, he knew their representatives in Europe, he got research grants to support his writing activities for the first 5 years that he was in the US. It was only in 1945 that, again, through the friends of his, he was able to get a visiting professorship in the Graduate School of Business Administration at New York University, which he held from 1945 until he retired at the advanced age of 89 in 1969. Probably the longest Guinness Book of Record visiting professorship in human history.
Yeah, and it would have been so easy for him to start watering down his principles, compromising to get a nice position, to get popularity, because this guy was obviously a bigwig back in Austria, but he never did that. He stood fast by his principles, and he turns out to be, for that reason, a tremendous inspiration for people like you and so many others that are now advocates of free market economics, genuine free market economics in the Austrian, what is commonly known as the Austrian school. Okay, Richard, we're out of time. We got to wrap things up. Time goes by fast when you're having a good time, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you all for tuning in. Come and visit us at FFF.org. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much. And Richard, I look forward to seeing you next week.
Till next time.